Let's pivot to the other topic that I really want to touch with you, and we'll see if there's a way to deal with this well, because this is a difficult topic. Me Too. I mean, you wrote I think it was back in December, you wrote a piece in the New Yorker titled Al Franken's Resignation and the Selective Force of hashtag Me Too. And and this piece really struck me. The one thing you said is, this is now quoting you, the force that is ending his political career, this is Al Franken, is greater than the truth. This force operates on only roughly half of this country's population, those who voted for Hillary Clinton and who consume what is still refer to as mainstream media. And what you acknowledge in that piece is that there's this spectrum of indiscretion that we need to figure out how to talk about and respond to. And it ranges from true criminality on one extreme, rape and sexual assault, to bad jokes and inept flirting on the other. And so you've worried that we're being plunged into this wholesale renegotiation of sexual norms in our society, and it's causing us to ignore these important moral distinctions. That there is a spectrum here, and Bill Cosby and Harvey Weinstein are on one side of it, and I think everyone agrees that they deserve all the outrage that's been directed at them and whatever legal process gets directed at them. But then there are cases that are far less clearly about abuse on the part of the men involved, and there really seem to have been a few cases where they were just fairly normal sexual misadventures that just got nearly criminalized in the media. So feel free to demur if your views have changed on this at all. But let's talk about, are there some clear landmarks here? How are you thinking about Me Too and the response to it, and perhaps what you described at one point as an emerging, quote, sex panic, or as I would refer to more generically as a moral panic? How are you thinking about Me Too at the moment?
So, I have a lot of thoughts about Me Too, and my biggest frustration with it is that we're not having a nuanced conversation about it at all. And I think there are reasons why we're not having a nuanced conversation about it, but that's, I think when it comes to sex, especially, the conversation needs to be careful, and we need to be able to parse things out. But what to start with the piece that you quoted, what I was concerned about at the time, and I think is still an important point about the whole movement, is that it's very much a reaction to the election of Donald Trump, and I think sort of on a psychological level, it's a result of the shock that many of us experienced when we saw that the Access Hollywood tape was not a disqualifying event. And I think the reaction is sort of, I don't want to live in a society in which that's not a disqualifying event. So I am going to legislate the part of this country that I live in, or participate in legislating the part of this country that I live in differently, so that it becomes a disqualifying event for men who inhabit this part of the country. That, I think we have to somehow try to think about that, about what happens when society is sort of trying to legislate a part of it separately, right? To create rules of behavior that don't apply, that clearly, don't apply sort of on the federal level, but apply to a fraction of society. But, and so, the normal institutions are not involved. And I'm not saying that that never happens, and I'm not saying that that's necessarily a terrible thing, but to me, that's a thing that needs to be acknowledged and examined. So that's one point. Another point is that, the way there are two kinds of discourses that I have heard about Me Too. One is the language of revolution. And in this language of revolution, it suggests that there's a wholesale changeover of norms related to sex and flirting and relationships, and it's going to claim victims, perhaps an excess of victims, because that's just how revolutions work. I find that view disturbing and unsatisfying. Another view is the view of retribution, the language of retribution, right? And that's how, okay, so Al Franken did something wrong. Maybe it wasn't as enormous an offense as something that should land someone in court and has rightly landed people like Bill Cosby or Harvey Weinstein in court and in prison. But there should still be retribution exacted. I'm not interested in retributive justice. I am interested in restorative justice, which is an entirely different kind of language, an entirely different way of thinking about it. So, and you ask me what I'm thinking about Me Too now. I was at the Sydney Writers' Festival when the Juno Diaz thing went down. So Juno Diaz had written an essay in The New Yorker about having been sexually abused as a child and having, for lack of a better term, acted like an asshole in his relationships as a result of that. And a couple of weeks after that, there was the Sydney Writers' Festival, and he was confronted with a question from the floor on during one of his panels by a younger writer, also from New York, who said that he had tried to forcibly kiss her. And then it had this kind of pile-on effect, both from writers physically present at that festival and then on Twitter. And Juno Diaz withdrew from the festival. A lot of his public events were canceled. Bookstores started pulling his books. And since then, MIT has conducted an investigation and has apparently concluded that there's no issue with his continuing to teach there. At least one of the women who accused him of, and she accused him really of just having like demeaned her in public in a way that it really had nothing to do with sex, but as she portrayed it, had everything to do with sexism, but turned out not to be true. The whole story turned out to be not true. And I found the experience of a bunch of writers engaging in what now in retrospect certainly looks like a kind of mob, a minor expression of mob behavior, and proving themselves to be completely incapable of having an actual conversation.
Yeah.
In words, which happens to be our profession. I found that incredibly disheartening. And then there was also the Sydney Writers' Festival, which kept sending out, which just completely refused to acknowledge the whole thing, and kept sending out cheery emails saying an exciting literary weekend ahead.
Right.
Instead of using this incredible opportunity to actually have a meaningful conversation.
Yeah, well, really, it does come down to a failure of conversation. It's like there are certain topics where everyone has a certain tripwire installed in their mind, and once it's tripped, not only is there an emotional hijacking of each side of the conversation, there's the rules of civil and intellectually honest exchange get ignored, right? With disconcerting certainty, really. You just have people who will straw man the other side relentlessly, never engage with a charitable reconstruction of the view they're claiming to argue against or the set of facts they're claiming to debunk. Just to take one case, which this is just a micro example of no real importance, but in hearing, the Matt Lauer case talked about, what was seized upon most often in my review of it was the fact that he had a button installed at his desk that could lock his door, right? And this was spun endlessly as some kind of rape device, right? Like he's going to lock women into his office and abuse them, as though even if this were possible, this would contain the reputational damage. I mean, like, if you could just lock a woman in, once she gets out, she's not going to tell people what happened, as though this would be any abuser's strategy. But the reality is that the button like that almost certainly served another purpose and certainly didn't lock the door from the inside. It would have locked it from the outside. It would have locked people out, right? And this is a button that would be installed if you want to make sure you can lock your door without having to get up if you're someone like Matt Lauer and you don't want people wandering into your office, or, presumably some security person advised them that if there were ever an active shooter situation in the network, you'd want to be able to lock the doors of the principals, instantly. But this couldn't possibly have been a way of him impeding a woman's escape from his clutches. And yet this was the thing that got so much focus. And it just would have taken 2 seconds to have kind of thought about some other charitable interpretation of what this button could have meant. And there are hundreds of examples of this sort of thing. It's amazing how difficult it can be just to keep a dispassionate and honest conversation going on these topics.
Yeah, well, these are passionate topics, and, I can certainly see that from the point of view of a woman who is trapped in Matt Lauer's office, if that happened, the existence of that button is an absolutely terrifying fact. But you're right, about the reporting. It's devolved into a very unsophisticated conversation.
So what has been the response to your sounding off on this topic? I mean, you've written a few, if I'm not mistaken, a
Yeah, I
few.
think three.
Yeah.
No, the response has been great. I've heard from a lot of people. I mean, there does seem to be a real age divide, I think, among women. I think younger women tend to see this concern and skepticism as misguided, and women, 50 and over, tend, I think, to share a lot of. I mean, women I come in contact with. It's not a huge number of women, but sort of in the publishing world in New York, certainly tend to share these concerns with the language used and with the sweeping accusations and really just the because also there was that shitty media men list.
Oh, the Google Doc, yeah.
Yeah, the Google Doc, which again for those listeners who might have missed it, it was a Google Doc that was put up by a young New York City writer, in which she, I think, took great care to sort of say, please keep this anonymous. These are merely accusations or observations. But anyway, she sort of really tried to couch it in a way that was careful, and she intended it to be a confidential document that would warn women about men that they might want to avoid in certain circumstances. And I think there's no reason to believe that she wanted it to be public. I think she honestly thought it could be kept confidential. Of course, it was leaked within, I think, hours of going online, and she took it down very fast. But copies of it circulated and have had a devastating effect, I think, on the well-being, if not the careers, of several men. And again, there's this there's the view that I can understand that, look, these incredibly privileged men who may have had aspersions cast on them have suffered some discomfort, but have not suffered some great loss. And I'm convinced that the woman, Maura Donegan, who created the list, had no such intention. But for those men, this is not something they can take lightly, and for a lot of their colleagues, it is a disturbing and chilling and sometimes catastrophic event. And again, in this particular situation, I don't think there are actually any bad actors, but I think it's a pretty sad outcome.
Yeah, so I feel the impulse to speak a little defensively on both of our behalfs just for a moment, because I don't want what I said about Matt Lauer's lock button to be construed as a defense of his case, because I don't consider myself informed about what he did or even what the full range of allegations were about him. So, he could be as terrible as alleged or not. I'm uninformed. That was just an example of a detail that I felt was getting the most paranoid interpretation where other more plausible interpretations existed.
Right.
And in your defense, I just want to, because you, by some listeners, I'm sure will be convicted of a somewhat galling level of insouciance around sexual harassment and this issue. But I want to just read something you wrote in one of your pieces that is surprisingly personal and powerful here, which is it just tells people where you're coming from. This is quoting you in one of your New Yorker pieces. I'm not trying to straddle the divide between cultures. I fall squarely on one side of the chasm. I have written, quote, Me Too, because I have been raped by a man, a stranger, coerced into sex by a man, a friend, and held hostage by a man's, my boss's, compulsion to talk about sex and take and exhibit pictures of sex. I'm also queer, and I panic when I sniff sex panic. The problem is that and this is a little further down, the problem is that it serves to blur the boundaries between rape, nonviolent sexual coercion, and bad, fumbling, drunken sex. The effect is to criminalize bad sex and trivialize rape. Actually, I thought it was important to tell people
Thank you.
where you're
Thank
coming
you.
from.
A couple of stories have really made this clear. The Aziz Ansari story and the initial stories about Glenn Thrush, the New York Times reporter. And both of these stories, I mean, the sort of the content is a little bit different, but they're stories about powerful men, well-known men. One obviously a celebrity, the other not so much, but in their fields, powerful and well-known men, and young, ambitious women. And both of these, both the women and the men, trying to wield a kind of power, a kind of sexual power, and that not working out well. It was very clear to me from reading the Aziz Ansari story and from reading the Glenn Thrush story that here were women who wanted to flirt, to use their sexual power, and I'm going, I'm going to get slaughtered for this, I think, but to use their sexual power to make connections or to even just have an interesting and memorable kind of social experience, but also perhaps to get professional advantage. At least one of the women in the Glenn Thrush story was very clear about that, and the men then acting like assholes. And I think that what not to take anything away from the men acting like assholes, except that I don't think it's criminal, and I'm not sure that it ought to be punishable by such incredibly humiliating public exposure. But what's really missing for me in the reporting is an acknowledgement that both sides do have power, and both sides are and they're wielding their power asymmetrically, and it doesn't end well. But it's not because one side is entirely powerless and the other one is entirely powerful, which is how it's framed, which is simply not an accurate reflection of how these things work in 2017, 2018.
Yeah, I think in one of your pieces you pointed out the irony of that this is a massive denial of agency to women, and I think you wrote about the example of a rock star who recently said that he'll no longer hook up with fans even if they have initiated things because he thought the power of his fame was so compelling that they would be unable to truly consent to having sex with him. And I don't know, I mean, we might wonder about the wisdom of being a rock star hooking up with fans again and again, but it does suggest an almost Victorian picture of womanhood in 2018.
Utterly infantilizing.
Yeah. To push back a little bit against the line you've taken here, I did notice that another journalist, Rebecca Traister, responded to one of your New Yorker pieces, and I'll just read what she said here because she's someone who I've also invited on the podcast. We haven't made it work yet, but she's further to, I guess I would be tempted to call the left of any of the noises we've been making on this topic thus far. And so here she writes, Masha Gessen has written for The New Yorker with perspicacity in past weeks about how this moment risks becoming a sex panic, that one of the perils at hand as we try to parse how butt groping or unsolicited kissing can exist on the same scale as violent rape is a reversion to attitudes about women as sexually infantilized victims. Her concerns are valid, pressing, yet I fear that the category collapse that makes Gessen anxious is being misunderstood in part because we're making a crucial category error. Because the thing that unites these varied revelations isn't necessarily sexual harm, but professional harm and power abuse. These infractions and abuses are related, sometimes they are combined, but their impact, the reasons that they are sharing conversational and journalistic space during this reckoning, need to be clarified. We must regularly remind everyone paying attention that sexual harassment is a crime not simply on the grounds that it is a sexual violation, but because it is a form of discrimination. What say you, Masha Gessen?
Oh, that's an excellent point. I have really nothing to say to that because she puts it beautifully. No, that's exactly right.
Right. But again, it fails to nominate a bright line that could guide the behavior of men and women in the workplace, it seems to me. So it's like I guess the bright line would be never hook up with someone beneath you in the hierarchy of your job, and or whether you're in academia, never, if you're a professor, never hook up with one of your graduate students, or even or anyone beneath you in the ivory tower, or who could reasonably worry about their professional advancement should things go badly. Is that an algorithm we can just run everywhere and spare everyone a lot of pain?
I'm not sure that that's desirable. That seems like a very appealingly legalistic way of thinking about it. But, and I know that we have Tinder now, and we don't really have to flirt in the workplace. but, but come on. Most people don't have a whole lot of social outlets outside of work. Where else are you supposed, especially in an academic setting?
Okay, well, then in the absence of that, in the absence of a clear policy, something like the Pence rule, to remind people of this, how far he takes it. But it shouldn't surprise you. I meet many people in business, who are certainly not religious. They're not, Christian theocrats, but they follow the Pence rule that they just don't have a meeting alone with a woman at this point, or a lunch alone with a woman, and that's its own professional harm. It seems
Absolutely.
I'm not the first to point this out.
Yes. Yeah, I think, and I think that needs to be worried about more. That again, my own background is I spent so many years working in Russia, which in some ways is a more egalitarian society, in some ways is a much more sexist society than the U.S. But one of the great impediments to my work was my lack of access to bathhouses, because so many important
Hmm.
conversations among men take place in the bathhouse, and male reporters could go to the bathhouse, and I couldn't. And that to me is an image, that like it floats to the surface of my consciousness immediately when I hear about people in business not taking meetings with women alone, sort of thing, and that creates lots of meetings when they're men alone, or two men together. It's a kind of bathhouse phenomenon.
Right. Well, at least in Russia, they had an alibi. They were naked and sweating and in dirty water, so the women could hardly be invited. But in our context, we have no alibi. It's just going to be a nakedly harmful policy.